believe it or not, nearly everyone in the world looks at themselves and thinks, I could be better. Or they are enslaved to the practice of trying to make themselves better. We look at people that just look like they're absolutely in peak performance and hardly have any body fat on them, things like this. And we look at them and think, wow, I could be that person. I'd like to be that person. And yet not all of them necessarily, but a large majority of them actually devote quite a bit of time and effort to maintaining this appearance. And I only use this. I'm not trying to be critical of that. I'm just using that as simply as an illustration that we all have something that we don't like. We don't like the shape of our nose. We don't like our teeth. I've got crooked teeth. Things like that. We don't like our hair. I mean, I used to have more and it's disappearing. You get the point. We have things about ourselves that we don't like. And sometimes those things start quite early in life. It's like, why do I look like this? And why don't I look like that? And why am I short and not tall? Or why am I so tall and not more moderate? You know, there's all kinds of things like this that we struggle with. Sometimes I think we struggle with it because we live within a world system that is constantly pitching us the advertisement, and they've been doing this long before modern advertisements on television, internet, magazines, and things like this. This goes back to the early history of man. You can see this in Genesis chapter 5, that people, or Genesis 4, excuse me, you can see that people put an emphasis on the outer appearance. And yet, to some degree, some of this is what God planned. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we are looking at what is man, trying to answer what the Bible has to say about this. And there's certain passages we're going to touch on today that most of you are probably very familiar with, but do we ever take away from them some of the things that maybe we ought to think about? And we're going to try to take a look at some of those things about our physical nature, because right now we're talking about the fact that we're a physical being. We've seen there that we're spirit and that we're soul and what's involved with that, and the mind and the conscience and all these different immaterial parts of us. But now we're talking about our physical nature. And in Job chapter 10 and verse 8, so this is probably the first person to actually say these. Job probably predates either the time of Abraham or predates Abraham. That's just a guess. In Job 10 and verse 8, he says, your hands fashioned me, made me altogether, and yet you would destroy or swallow me up. As he's looking at this, remember now that you have made me like clay, and yet you're going to turn me back into dust again. To me, it's very interesting when you think about that you go over to Genesis chapter 2, and it says that God formed man from the dust of the ground. So it was made of clay, and you're going to turn me back to dust. Verse 10, did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? So it's as though you started with this totally liquid substance and curdled it, became something hard like cheese would. Cheese becomes, something more solid, and then you clothed me. And this word "clothed" indeed is one of the terms for clothing. The Hebrew word lavash, clothed me with skin and with flesh meaning like the muscle tissue, and you knit me together with bones and sinews, and you have then granted or made me to have life and loving kindness, and your care then has preserved my spirit. Job looks at his existence, and I don't think Job is just waxing poetic and say, hey, biology caused me to be the way I am. Job acknowledges that God had a point in that. If you've ever taken even high school biology, you learn something about genetics, and you realize that the mother contributes some DNA and the father contributes DNA, and we're told it's just random what DNA that you're going to end up with, and that DNA gets mixed, and it mixes just right to make you who you are, and a little bit of something that's off here or there causes sometimes very severe problems for people. Some people that can't survive because of problems that they're born with or they acquire even while they're in still within their mother. But then most of us are born, and when we're born, we've inherited this material, and we're taught that that's random. But Job is telling us it's not random. God's actually the one that puts all this together. And does he use the process of biology? Well, certainly does. But it's also very plain that he's the one that does this. A very classic passage that most of us know very well, we know this better than the passage we just looked at over in Job, is Psalm 139, verse 13. It says, "For you formed my," and the New American Standard has "inward parts." It's a word that referred to the kidneys, but since the kidneys are deep down inside us here, you can't see where I'm pointing very well, but they're deep down inside us, we understand that. It was a term that could be used generally for that which is within, which we don't normally see. And then it says, "And then you wove me." And we had this word, Job used the same term over there that we just read. "You wove me in my mother's womb." And he says, "And I will give thanks to you, for I am literally, fearfully, I am wonderful. I am made wonderful." It's in the Hebrew, it's a nifal verb. I am made wonderful. And then fearfully also in a form similar to this. Wonderful, same word that's used here, different form of it. He says, "Wonderful are your works." And I'm just letting you know, when you see it, it keeps highlighting the same term. This word wonderful actually goes to this particular word wonderful down here, but it doesn't pull up when you tap on the English. Anyway, wonderful are your works, and that's what we are. And my soul knows it very well. In other words, we're part of those works. Verse 15, "My frame," or my bones, this is the word that was translated, I believe, bones over there in Job, if I remember correctly. "It was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth." And depths of the earth, I believe, is not literally saying that that's where we came from. It's using this poetically to speak of the fact that we're formed within our mother and nobody sees what's going on in there. You can only see that something is growing. And it says, "Your eyes have seen my unformed substance." For those of you that have ever read the Lord of the Rings series, interesting enough, this is the word golem. And a golem was a Hebrew word meaning something that's kind of squished together, but it isn't taken its full form. And certainly, if you know anything about biology, you realize that there's state in which you can kind of see that there's something happening there, but it takes a while before it actually takes on a form that's human. And even at that stage, it's a while before you can tell exactly what it's going to turn out to be. Is it going to be a boy or is it a girl? What color? What's the skin tone? What's the hair color? Things like that. It's going to take a while for all that. But the point being, you've seen my unformed substance. And in your book, we also have this last little detail, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained, or were, in this case, planned or set out, formed for me, when as yet there was not one of them. God actually planned out our days, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this. It's one of the reasons I think as Christians that we ought to live with less fear. Been a good lesson for me because I'm a person that can tend to be a little on the cautious side with regard to some things that seem maybe dangerous or precarious. But I would say that the only thing that changes what's ordained is when we choose to operate outside the will of God, we may bring about for us as believers a life shorter than what God actually would have planned. What he wrote down and said, this man's going to live to be 81. And we might go home at 75 or 70 because we've been stubborn against the will of God. Just suggesting this. But all of this is going in there saying your physical nature and the length of days in which you live, it was all put together by God. Now, this is the important thing about that. We look at these things and we appreciate this. We run to these verses to try to promote what we call pro-life ideas, the sanctity of human life and things like this. And I appreciate all of that. But as believers, we oftentimes miss the fact that, a lot, what we're born with, this is the way God chose for me to be put together. You'd say, why did God decide that when your teeth had come in, they'd be crooked? And realize, before the modern advent of braces, you had this, you lived with this. You lived with this kind of stuff. Our family didn't spend money on braces when I was a kid. That's okay. Things like that. Why do some people see better than others? Why do some people have full heads of hair and other people lose it all or are in the process? There's all kinds of different things that we wonder about. But see, those are all covered in this. And so we who are living, it's more than just us looking and looking out to protect the unborn. It's also about us taking this and saying, look at yourself. You're a product of God taking something from your mother and something from your father and putting them together in exactly the way he wanted it put together so that you would be who you are. Here's a good lesson from biology. I think just all of you that are watching this, I think you know biology well enough that in the process of reproduction, a father contributes a lot of sperm in that process, and yet only one of them is going to be involved in fertilizing that egg. So out of all those million, there's not just a random one that makes it there. I would take, looking at this, that God chooses the one that gets there to put together exactly what he's looking for. I take this quite seriously. I realize some might think, well, you're pushing the boundaries of what the text is saying. I just think it's important for us to stop and think about the fact that this nature that we have, it was actually planned and put together by God. And did he use biology? Yes. But I don't think he uses biology in terms of the randomness that we are taught in modern science. I think we need to take seriously what Job and what the psalmist is saying here, that God really did put us together the way we are. Now, granted, are there things that we do to negatively affect that? Sure there are. We don't take care of ourselves, maybe. We eat maybe a diet that's not healthy and it takes its effect on us. We maybe have certain issues that we don't want to deal with them, so we just kind of clam up and we just isolate ourselves. There's all kinds of things that we as humans do that aren't good for us, where we're taking this nature that God gave us, even with its limitations, and we just let those things govern us, and we don't use them properly. We don't live to the glory of God, even with the limitations that we have. And I think that that's something really for us to think about. I want to look at one text before we close today. And it's we'll probably come back to this in our next study again. But in John 9:1, it says, as he passed by, that is, Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, many of us know this, as we know. As said, there are certain things that happen so that things come together and maybe some things don't work quite right. And so you might have a child born blind, and this man was blind from birth. So his disciples asked him, Rabbi, well, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents? Now, this is the funniest one in here. When you say this man, you're going, well, he was born blind. So what did he do? Well, it was taught, it was a popular teaching within the Jewish circles that a child, when they were still unborn, if on the Sabbath day, that child, if you've ever been around a woman that's expecting a child, you realize that child moves around in there a lot, and it's fun to see, oh, look there's a foot, and oh, look at that, how it's moving around in there. But they said if a child was overly active on the Sabbath, it was breaking the Sabbath, and therefore they claimed sometimes that when children were born with what we would call impairments, maybe a hand doesn't work right, maybe they're born blind, maybe they've got other problems, whatever it might be, they blamed it on that, potentially on that child for sinning. Or sometimes, the parents were horrible sinners, and so the child is suffering the effects of the parents' sin. But notice what Jesus goes on to say. And Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned, nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me. Jesus is going to heal this man, And this man was born blind. And I've had people object to this, going, this is terrible. This man had to live blind so that he could get to this point, and then Jesus heals him. Well, that's not fair that he lived all those years without it. But you know what? You never find that in the story. The man is so elated. He's so glad that he's healed. And he even comes back and worships Jesus when Jesus finally reveals himself to the man. And he ridicules the religious leaders for not believing in Jesus. He doesn't sit there and grouse over the fact that I've spent 20 years blind because God wanted me to blind so he could do a work. He didn't do that. The point being with these is that sometimes there are things that we have that God uses to an end that he has. And since we are human and we don't understand and think about God's plan, we don't know the details of his plan, then we miss out on understanding these things. So, yeah, we've got this nature. It's got things that are imperfect. We're on this side of the fall, and on this side of the fall, this nature is not permanent, and it certainly has problems, the effect of sin in it. But nonetheless, God still is putting it together, and he still has a purpose, and he still uses it to glorify himself, just as he did with this man that was born blind. And he can do the same with us. Yeah. If we're foolish and do something foolhardy and we break a limb or something like that, and we suffer from that broken limb, and maybe it's a long-term effect, maybe for years and years we suffer from complications due to that. Yeah, there are choices we make. But in our very nature, and by the way, God can use those things too. We certainly know he can. But in the nature with which we're born, whether that nature is from a human perspective perfect, you get the baby, you look, oh, all the fingers are there, all the toes are there, oh, the lips, and my wife said she did this with both of our little girls when they were born. I got to help with one of them. I remember holding one of them, brand new, just born, and take her out and ran the little tests that they do on to see, how this newborn infant is. And to me, it was amazing. But my wife is checking to see if all these things, just to check out her little girls. And the thing is, whether we come out exactly perfect or whether we come out and something isn't what it should be from a normal point of view, it still is what God planned. It's still what God put together. And rather than sitting and living our lives feeling sorry for ourselves and grousing, we could stop and say, God has something to do, even through this. And I look at that. I don't have those I wasn't born with any of those kind of things to my knowledge, but I certainly have my own set of weaknesses. And yet, despite those things, I get to watch God use me. And I get to watch God use lots of other people, even people that are like you and I, because this is true of all of us, even if we've got perfect vision and we can smell and we can hear and we're not losing our hair, whatever it might be, if it's exactly what we think is perfect and you're absolutely physically fit and all that, you know what? We still have problems. And God still works. Right? Doesn't he? He does. He put us together. And we need to appreciate the fact, this nature that we have, this physical nature, he put it together as much as he put together our spirit and our soul. Trust that encourages you with regard to who you are, where you are, and some of God's purpose for you in your life. And we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about this in our next study. In the meantime, have a good day up there in the Lord, and I want to thank you for joining me.